Всем привет из Лондона! Сегодня в центре английской столицы мы поищем следы нашего футбола. И для этого нам нужно отправиться в книжный магазин буквально здесь за углом. Ну а затем вы даже не представляете, куда эта история нас приведет. Так что поехали! С одной стороны, мир стал цифровым, но есть вещи, которые остались с нами из прошлого. До сих пор мы гуляем по улицам, а не доверяемся виртуальной реальности. И вот здесь, в центре Лондона, завернув на Пикадилли Роуд, вот туда, мы тоже окунемся в одну очень важную вещь, казалось бы, из прошлого, но на самом деле из настоящего. Многоэтажный книжный магазин. Да, еще такие остались в современном мире, и вы сейчас увидите, насколько крутые. Футбол в Англии религия, ну а книги о футболе в Англии тоже очень популярны. Огромные полки, биографии, тактика. В общем, все, что может поместиться на полках Лукомского. Тут легко залипнуть на целый день. Столько интересных книжек. Но я предлагаю вам остановиться на Джонатане Уилсоне по одной простой причине. Уилсон в своей книжке «Перевернутая пирамида» суммировал всю мировую тактику, ну а также написал исследование на тему восточноевропейского футбола. Кстати, «Перевернутую пирамиду» Уилсона перевели на русский, перевели плохо и назвали, знаете как? Назвали «Революция на газоне». Я сначала думал, что это книга о садоводстве. Но нет, она об эволюции игры. Рекомендую. Вообще у Уилсона 11 книжек. Все они нон-фикшн, документальные, про историю футбола. Но вот только что он написал первый в своей жизни роман. И называется эта книга «Стрельцов». Да, про нашего Эдуарда Стрельцова. Но в книжных магазинах Стрельцова купить нельзя. Она распространяется только через издательство. Именно поэтому самый лучший способ связаться с самим Джонатаном Уилсоном и получить у него интервью и книгу. Итак, поскольку Стрельцов в книжных магазинах не продается, мы с вами оказываемся на станции Воксхолл. Способ получения книги усложняется, и здесь я жду литературного агента Джонатана Уилсона, некоего Мэтта. Мэтт, как настоящий Дед Мороз, везет мне экземпляр Стрельцова, а может быть даже два. Ну и пока я его жду, нужно быть аккуратным, потому что вот там вдали здание британской разведки. И, в общем, думаю, что они не очень довольны, когда в их направлении работает камера. Так, Мэтт не захотел позировать на камеру, вот он уходит, а у меня в руках остается зеленый пакет из супермаркета, в котором просто целая куча Стрельцовых. Будем считать это новогодним подарком и дальше отправляемся лично к Джонатану Уилсону. Никогда еще не носил книги в пакете из супермаркета. Кстати, я заберу себе 2 экземпляра, как сказал Мэтт, а остальные, их тут, как видите, много, нужно передать автору. Такую миссию я тоже еще в своей жизни никогда не выполнял. Итак, 3 остановки до Джонатана Уилсона на поезде. Вот сам Джонатан, но я бы на первой странице отметил упоминание нашего друга Саши Горюнова, который не мог не помочь Джонатану написать книгу о России. Ну и такая фишка от Уилсона, главы здесь прописаны по-русски. Я думаю, что с этим Саша тоже помогал. Эх, а первая строчка текста, знаете какая? Накануне я выпил слишком много водки. А как еще может быть в годовщину? Об этом мы отдельно спросим Уилсона. Вот в таких маленьких кафе пишутся книги о тяжелой судьбе. А вот и наш автор. Hi. Англичанин, который любит советский и российский футбол. 5 причин почему. Okay, reason number 1
was in 1966 the Soviet Union stayed in Sunderland, and obviously that's before I was born. But each of the games they played at Roker Park, my dad went to, and he talked about seeing Lev Yashin, and Yashin was a celebrity even over here, and he was, yeah, my dad was somebody who was not easily excited by famous people, not easily excited by footballers, and yeah, he was a Sunderland season ticket holder from the end of the Second World War. He saw a lot of football, and Yashin was one of the people he always talked about. So Yashin had that charisma, that style, that even my dad was impressed by Yashin.
Reason number 2?
The first World Cup I remember was 1982. The first one I really began to understand was 1986, and the Soviet Union in that World Cup were a brilliant team to watch. Played incredible football, and there were two players in that World Cup who, when you were playing football in the schoolyard, if somebody smashed the ball from 20 metres into the corner, there were two players whose names you'd shout out. One was Josimar from Brazil, and one was Vasily Rats. So I know that's Ukrainian rather than Russian, but a Soviet player. And then even the way they went out to Belgium was such a great game. And I was 9 years old, I didn't understand football, but I knew they were an exciting team and I knew I wanted to watch them.
Number 3.
1992, I went on a school exchange to Tambov. I think Russia was the 5th country I ever went to outside of the UK. And so, especially when you're 16, you absorb the experience, you absorb the life. And it's obviously very, very different to the northeast of England. And I had a great time there. And the students from Tambov came to Newcastle, where I was at school. And that gave me that sort of confirmed my fascination with Russia.
4.
In February 2006, that was Behind the Curtain, which is looking at Eastern European football and how the fall of communism had changed Eastern European football. And I remember going to Russia, more digging. I talked to Nikita Simonian, who was incredibly generous at this time, fascinating interview. I talked to Axel Bartanian, who has so many documents. I spent like 5 hours with Axel Bartanian, and the story fascinated me. It just struck me as being, this is a great story of a state that people felt they couldn't trust, but also a player who was very complex in many ways.
Number 5.
Another reason for fascination with literature, that clearly Russian novels are the greatest novels of the 19th century, apart from Dickens and George Eliot. But Dickens, George Eliot, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, they're the big four. Not the French, definitely not the French. They're the big four. I thought because Sтрельцов is such a flawed character, such an interesting character, that a purely factual retelling doesn't tell you enough, and it was right to be novelised. And so during lockdown, when I had time, I thought, I'm going to try and write this. And I'd actually written the first page maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I never got any further. But lockdown, I suddenly had time, and I made myself every day, I'm going to write 500 words. And I was very fortunate that a lot of people in Russia were very supportive and gave me a lot of help in terms of research. Hopefully, fingers crossed, hopefully I've done it justice.
Одну книжку я заберу себе, и Джонатан подпишет ее моим именем, извините. А вторая книга уйдет тому, кто выиграет в нашем конкурсе. Итак, извините, это мне. Зато вот это тому, кто определит фейковую историю. Этой книжкой лично меня Джонатан озадачил, и эти вопросы я задам ему лично. Джонатан, why novel, not non-fiction?
Well, I've sort of told the story in a non-fiction way in Behind the Curtain, but I think the novel allows you to play around with it a bit more, to try and work out motivations. And one of the great fascinations of the story is we don't really know what happened. What struck me was it was very similar to A Passage to India, the English novel by Ian Forster, which hinges on a rape which may or may not have happened. Once I realised that parallel, it seemed logical to sort of pursue that. And what that then enables you to do is, without being too constrained by the very precise details, you can try and find an emotional truth. You can try and explore sort of culturally almost what the feeling of the story was. And that's why I tell it through the eyes of this functionary at the club. It's not just about this huge celebrity, this great player. It's about how that impacted on ordinary people.
But why Стрельцов?
I think Streltsov, it's a fascinating story because we don't know the truth of it. I mean, honestly, if you put me on the spot and said, do I think he did it? Yeah, I do. I think there's only two possibilities. Either he did it, or Karakhanov, the Air Force officer, he somehow snuck into the room where Streltsov was with Marina, and he sort of abused her while Streltsov was asleep in this sort of drunken coma, which is possible because they did have the same blood group. I also think it's it's a common thing you see with sports people, that they have this sort of great physical power, often a great physical beauty. They're used to their bodies being sort of this great source of power, and that often leads them into difficulties with women. That it's interesting to explore of almost the right that people, the famous people, that sports people think they have, and where that level of fame can lead them if they're used to getting their own way and suddenly they don't get their own way. How do they respond to that? Oh, yeah, I mean there are two ways of looking at this. Either he's the victim of a political conspiracy, or he's the victim of his fame and the recklessness that comes with that fame, the sense of somehow consequences don't happen to him, that things go wrong and some people at the club or some people in the party will sort it out. I don't think you can say the police investigation is conducted particularly well. I think they decided very early he was guilty and they accumulated the evidence to prove that. Now that's not proof at all of a political conspiracy, and it may well be that it was so obvious he was guilty that actually that was the reasonable way of doing things. A fascinating topic. In fact, in two ways. So one is the way that being famous, having things done for you, and this certainly applies to modern footballers, if your actions don't have consequences, or if your actions become divorced from their consequences, if you don't sort of realise how they impact on people in the wider world, then of course it changes your morality. Of course it does. And so that doesn't excuse or exonerate him, but it is to an extent an explanation perhaps. There's also the fact that so many people want him to be innocent. We're in a world where you see people sort of almost choosing their own truths, so people don't want to believe that COVID exists. Yeah, they don't want to believe that, I don't know, even in a football sense, they don't want to believe an obvious foul was a penalty, and they come up with these bizarre conspiracies to explain them. And that, I think, is a fascination, it's almost like Russian football needs this martyr, and Streltsov fulfills that role. But he's at the very least a very, very flawed character.
You mention vodka in your first line of the book.
Yeah.
Why? It's your hook?
Alcohol plays a big part in the story. One of the reasons why it's so difficult to work out what happened is everybody was drunk when it happened. Everybody was drunk. The other figure who he reminds me of, in some ways, not in all, is George Best. That he suddenly becomes a celebrity, can't handle it, the sort of structures aren't there to support him, and that creates this great pressure, and he turns to alcohol as a relief and turns to women as a relief, as Best did. And also, if I'm being honest, when I went to see Axel Vartanian afterwards, I drank far too much vodka, I fell asleep on the metro and I got robbed, and I had to walk back several miles down the Purple Line in a snowstorm while really quite drunk. So maybe that put the association of vodka and Streltsov in my mind, but yeah, I think alcohol does play a big part in the story.
What English people know about Streltsov?
I mean, I think that's quite difficult to answer. I think football people who know sort of football history, I think it's a famous story. I think he's remembered as the great player who could have been. That had he gone to the '58 World Cup, then maybe it wouldn't have been Pelé who dominated that tournament. Maybe it would have been him. But I also think if you went round, 100 people round here on the streets and asked them, I'm pretty sure 100 would not have heard of him. Yeah, I mean, please do read the book. It's in some ways it's not really about Streltsov. Streltsov is the background, he's the hook, but it's actually about Vanya. And Vanya is this a figure who, for various reasons, is very much a loner, and he struggles to deal with life. And Streltsov is somebody who I think it's not too strong to say he falls in love with Streltsov, and Streltsov doesn't know who Vanya is, he doesn't care, he's one of these guys at the club, and Streltsov ends up betraying him, and I think that's a very universal story.
Итак, за своим флэт-вайтом Джонатан расскажет 5 историй о Стрельцове, одна из них будет фейковая, и вы должны будете угадать, какая именно.
So story 1. Streltsov's father was an intelligence officer who stayed behind in Kiev after the war and abandoned his family. Story number 2. Sтрельцов scored a hat-trick on each of his first 2 appearances for the Soviet Union. Story number 3. Streltsov scored in the 1956 Olympic final despite having broken a bone in his foot. Streltsov was criticised by Pravda for having bought a coat with epaulets on the shoulders. Story number 5. Streltsov once missed a train to Leipzig for a World Cup qualifier and had to chase it in a taxi.
С пакетом книжек Джонатан возвращается к себе домой писать что-то новое. Ну а мы должны уточнить условия конкурса. Итак, книга «Стрельцов» за подписью автора Джонатана Уилсона едет для вас из Англии. И 2 этапа конкурса у нас с вами будет. Первый. Вы определяете фейковую историю из тех 5, которые рассказал Джонатан Уилсон о Эдуарде Стрельцове. Ну а затем наш обычный метод случайный выбор. Машинка выбирает финального победителя, кому и отправится книжка «Стрельцов». Итак, подписывайтесь на канал. Скоро новые видео.